So first skill we're going to look at is how to do an average in Google Sheets. So we want to average all of these cells. So we click equals, or we type equals rather, and it asks us if it wants an average, but if it doesn't, we type average and then a bracket, and then we select by clicking and dragging on the cells that we want to average, and then close the bracket. Press enter and it gives us our average. Now it just asked us if we wanted to do the same for here, and we do. So if that suggestion has gone away, we can click on the bottom right corner where it shows up as a cross and drag that down to all of the ones that we want. You can see if we drag that even further, it's getting an error here because there's no data to work from. Okay, so going to our graphing skills. Here's a sample graph. It's an X versus Y graph. X is always going to be our independent variable, and Y is always going to be our dependent variable unless we are told otherwise. So to make a graph, what we can do is click and drag on all of the cells that we want to be in the graph, and then click insert and chart, and it's guessed for us what we want the graph to be. It's given us our X on our horizontal and our Y on our vertical axis. But if it didn't for some reason guess correctly, we should know how to create a chart anyway. So what we're going to do is open a chart by going insert chart once again. Then we select the type of chart we want, which is a scatter chart always for this standard. We're going to add x-axis, and it gets select data range, so we click on the box there, and the data that we select for our x-axis is going to be our x data, so that's A1 through to A7. We go OK, and then we go down to series. So we click on add series, we click on the select data range button, and then we select our Y data. Okay, we go OK, B1 to B7, and look, you can see we have some sort of curved graph, as you would expect. So we go over to customize. First thing I want to look at is the fact that our x-axis doesn't go down to 0, so we click horizontal axis and we go to where it says minimum value. We force it to be 0, and you can see that we get this nice curved graph. We could suspect at this point that it's an x squared graph, but to make it clearer, we're going to click on series and scroll down to where we see trend line. Now this linear trend line doesn't fit our data, so we're going to change it to polynomial, and you can see that it lines up nicely with our data points. But our chart's not done yet. We need to add titles because you get marked down if you don't have chart title. And so our chart is going to be called X versus Y. We always want independent versus dependent. Then we also want the Y and the X to be labeled. And so we're going to call the horizontal axis X. You will have some sort of unit as well. Always make sure you have the unit. And we're going to have Y in some sort of unit. Okay, and so there's our x squared graph. That looks like an x squared to us. So what we're going to do is we're going to transform our data so that we turn our x squared data into a straight line graph. And the way we do that is we take I'm going to insert a column to the right of our x, and we're going to call this column x squared. in that first cell, we're going to go equals and click the next cell next to it, which is this one, A2, multiplied. So that's shift 8 multiplied by itself, which is what squared is. Press enter, and we get 1. A2 times A2 is 1, and then we just drag down. So we have our column of x squared data now, and we're going to drag over to select our y as well. Now we can again select insert chart, and there it's guessed. And it's guessed pretty well. It knows that we want this sort of graph. It's given us our title, which we are going to change by double clicking. Remember, we want independent times versus dependent. And oops. And we want our units. Now, on our squared, it's going to be unit squared. Okay, whatever the unit was before, it's going to be squared because we've squared the data, so the unit is also squared. We probably also want to make sure we go down to a minimum of 0 on our x-axis or our x squared axis now, and that will show us a nice straight line. So we need, for the second graph as well, we need to have our trend line. So series, scroll down to trend line. This time it will be linear, and we're going to give it another color just so it's easier to see maybe. And now we need to also know the equation for this line. So we're going to go to label and select use equation. So it's told us that this is the equation for this line is 3x plus 0. So our y-intercept is 0, as we can see there. So when we write it into our books, we'll have y equals 3x plus 0. So that's our mx plus c. And I think that's complete for this x squared graph. Moving on to our next set of data, we are going to go to square root of x. And so how do we know it's square root of x? Well, when we created the chart, we saw that it had some sort of shape that was upwards curvy. If we were to force our minimum x value to be 0, we would see that it's curving downwards towards 0. So if we want further proof, we go to series and select trend line and make that trend line polynomial. Okay, so we have our y versus x, and we suspect this is probably x squared, square root of x. So one way we can deal with square root of x is by squaring y instead. So we create a column to the left of our y column, call it y squared, and we do the same thing that we did in the last sheet. So equals, and then select shift 8 for times, it's the asterisk, and then the same cell again. So we drag that down to make a whole column of y squareds, and then when we make our new graph, it will be x versus y squared. And it should be straight this time. If we go to series and trend line, we should see a linear relationship, and we give it the label of the equation. Another option is to, instead of doing y squared, we can square root x. And so if we sqrt x, so we go equals square root sqrt, and then select the cell, and then press enter, and that's taken the square root of all of these x values. So if we then insert a new chart based on that data, we're going to get another straight line. We will go to the horizontal axis, force our minimum to be 0 so we can see it a bit clearer, and we have a nice straight line. This graph is going to look more or less the same as the previous graph. If we give it a trend line and force it to be the equation, it'll be a different equation. But now you need to make sure that your unit is the square root of your original x unit. Okay, so that's two ways to deal with a square root x relationship. Our final relationship is 1 over x. So if we were to make a graph out of this, we would see that we have a curve that goes like this. Let's force our horizontal axis to be starting at 0, and you can see that our graph goes upwards as it gets closer, as x gets closer to 0, and converges to 0 on the y-axis as x increases. On this graph too, maybe we want to add some more grid lines. This is kind of just cosmetic. We can change our grid lines to be smaller. That's every 1. You can have it every 0.5. Nope, maybe you can't. And then we can put ticks on the bottom if we want to. Okay. You can turn the grid lines on and off here, but it makes it easier to read the graph if you have them on, for the vertical and the horizontal axis as well. Final thing we need to do for this is to turn on our trend line, make it polynomial. Logarithmic is better for this one, because logarithms will go to 0 as x increases. We can also play around with the different types that it offers us. Probably not that one, because you see it has some kinks there. I think power series works best. We don't need to know what power series means, but this is our curved graph, and so for our curved graph we don't need to have any label. Okay, that's everything, I think. Let me know if you need any more assistance with this, but those are that's how to do averaging, how to turn an x squared graph into a straight line, how to turn a square root graph into a straight line, and how to turn a 1 over x graph into a straight line. There are, of course, many different equations you can use in Google Sheets. It's not limited to these ones I've shown you. So you can just click Google Sheets function list, and there's almost as many things as you can think of that you might want to do. All right, cheers.